Now. Hello, intellectually curious teens. My name is Ava.
And I'm Relly, and you're listening to Shut Up and Listen, our for now temporary name.
Yeah, very tentative. Before we get started, we just want to take a couple seconds to thank our sponsors, Haagen-Dazs and Besorus. Your ice cream bars and shidduch matchmaking skills are out of this world.
Okay, so now we have our question of the day from Hevel, okay? Tell me if you hear it.
Hello, Kinderlach. Welcome to Hillel's Fireside Chat. I've recently been thinking about the Beit Yosef and how he actually extends from what a knot is on Shabbat, a double knot, to what a knot in tzitzit is. He extends it and says that's also a double knot. And I was thinking about how he can actually extend from two completely unrelated areas of halacha, and it raised questions for me about when do we deliberately use logic that is a little bit contrived. Also, something else that's been on my mind is, have you ever noticed that women in Tanakh are almost always characterized based on their beauty?
You know what, Hillel? You actually bring up a fascinating point. Why are women often characterized solely by their beauty in Jewish text?
What does this mean for us as modern Jews and feminists? To have this discussion with us today, we have two very special Bronfmanim as guests, Imogen Lubin and Max Bamberger. Round of applause.
Woo-hoo.
You guys just want to introduce yourselves really quickly, like where you're from, who you are?
Sure. Imogen, do you want to start?
Hi, my name is Imogen Lubin. I live near Princeton, New Jersey. I am culturally Jewish and don't really know anything about this topic, but I am looking forward to learning and having this discussion.
And I'm Max Bamberger. I'm a modern Orthodox Jew from Berkeley, California, and I go to the Jewish Community High School in San Francisco. Super excited to be here. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, we're super excited to have you.
What does that mean?
I think it means it's time for the ice melter question. Woo!
Woo-hoo.
So today's ice melter question, if you could be any baked good, what would it be and why? Imogen, let's start with you.
Well, so there's actually been some controversy surrounding the tri-colored cookie in our group chat. So you know what? I'm gonna go ahead and identify with that baked good. I think they are delicious. They're like mini layered cakes with raspberry jam in between the layers and covered in chocolate. And I just think that's like the ideal treat. And I'm gonna stand by that.
Okay, starting us off with some controversy right
That
there.
was
How about you, Bambo?
I have an affinity inherited from my grandfather for almond treats, with like marzipan and almond croissants. Really, really, honestly, super delicious. There's like a sweetness, and it's kind of about the texture. But yeah, I recommend all you listeners go get yourself an almond croissant if possible.
Relly and I actually the other day were just talking about almond croissants, and there's actually some disagreement within our core team about whether they're superior or inferior to the croissants of chocolate, say.
Well, that actually brings me to my baked good, is that my favorite baked good on this planet is a croissant, specifically a chocolate croissant. So I'm just going to expand upon that and then I'll respond to the controversy. So I would be a chocolate croissant because at first it looks just like a regular croissant, which obviously is a good time. So I feel like when you see me, it's just like, okay, like she look okay, like a fun time, but like nothing exciting. And then like you eat a croissant and you're like, whoa, there's chocolate. So I feel like that's me. Like there's more to me than
That's interesting. So you're saying there's kind of there's an importance to the design of the timing of the eating experience, that you start with one thing and then as you bite in deeper, you get to something new.
Yeah, so like for some people that's like a good time, and some people might be like, I wish this was an almond croissant, and then to those people it's like, too bad.
Yeah.
But to the almond thing, Me and Ava were just discussing Trader Joe's frozen croissants, and I was saying that I like the chocolate ones. They kind of changed my life. But I haven't tried the almond one. It doesn't sound as good as the chocolate one, but like I guess I'll have to find out.
I kind of had, similar to my Jewish feminist journey, my almond croissant journey. At first, I was not so into them. I was more in the chocolate croissant camp, and then I kind of came around to it and understood that there's much more nuance within the flavor of the almond croissant. It's a little bit crunchy, a little bit grainy, but in a good way.
I'm also a big fan of like garnishes on top of things that give you hints as to what's going to be inside when you
like an image.
or like, you know how almond croissants have some almonds on, like little slices of almond on top sometimes.
Yeah.
I think that's really beautiful.
I think that plays into the idea of artistic unity, kind of like.
Yeah, 100%. And kind of the idea of in Judaism of pardes, where you have different layers of meaning to a text, and then those layers kind of refer to one another.
I guess that could also be applied to I call it a rainbow cake, but Imogen called it the tri-colored cake, is that they feed the different layers, feed into each other.
That's, and I don't know if this is completely relevant, but I'd love to just bring up the question of if these colors are always the same or if they change sometimes between cakes.
I think they're always the same.
So what colors are they?
I think it's like
Red, green, and yellow, right? I think so.
Wait, what did you say?
red, green, and yellow. I'm not sure what the significance to that is.
Red and blue.
Blue. No, I don't think blue.
Well, pluralism. You know what? It means pluralism.
Those might just be the kosher for Passover ones, which are the only
No,
ones.
I see red, yellow, and green, or variations of those colors, but it does raise the question of like, what is a rainbow? You know what I mean? How inclusive does a community have to be for it to truly call itself diverse?
I fully agree. I think we're gonna move along. I'm just gonna quickly interject.
What's your baked good? Is the almond croissant?
So no, it's not the almond croissant, although I'm a big fan. I think I would be a chocolate molten lava cake because I am a huge, huge fan. My sister makes them in little mugs, like individual ones, and they're just like, they're the best.
Yeah. I also
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I want to give a big shout out to eating things out of mugs that you wouldn't necessarily expect to eat out of a mug. I think hot chocolate and coffee and tea are pretty good in mugs, but say cereal and milk, soup, all of these things their quality is infinitely increased.
Recently, it's a little controversial. I know Ryan from our cohort is not a fan, but I've been drinking ice water in mugs.
Huh.
As you can't really see if this is a podcast, but it's right here. I think it's very good. It keeps it kind of insulated. It keeps it colder for longer. Big fan.
Just so you guys know, Ava puts an ungodly amount of ice in her water. And also, I looked it up, and you're right. The kosher for Passover tri-colored cakes, also it's green. I guess my eyes have mistaken me.
So it's really interesting. Sorry, I'm just gonna go ahead. I think we've been talking a lot about kind of the visual aspects of these baked goods,
100%.
right? And even though the value, I'd argue, of a baked good is in how it tastes and how the experience of eating it, we've been talking very significantly about how it looks to us and how that appeals to our senses and sort of influences our experience with the baked good. So I'm going to hand it over to Relly to myself. I'm going to hand it over to myself. And I'm going to start the conversation. So today we're talking about the role of beauty and specifically the descriptions of beauty of women in the Torah.
Yeah, and just to preface, we're going to be doing 4 women. So the first 2 we're going to juxtapose because they're sisters, and we're going to see the differences. And then later on, it's more random. But the first 2 are for Ava. So go ahead.
Yeah, So the first 2 we'll be talking about are Rachel and Leah. A little bit of background. Rachel and Leah are most significantly known for being two of the wives of Jacob, who was one of the patriarchs. Leah ended up having 7 children with Jacob, and Rachel ended up having only 2, most notably Joseph of the Technicolor Dreamcoat. And I just want to note also Leah had sons, and also Jacob's only daughter, Dinah, who we'll probably discuss in a later podcast. She has a very interesting story. So the reason we chose these 2 women to start off with is because they show up often really close to each other in the text as their sisters, and they're both married to the same person, and yet they're described very differently. Rachel is often described for her beauty. She's like the most beautiful woman. It says she's comely in features and comely to look at, and Jacob loves her. While Leah, sort of, it's implied that she doesn't have the same beauty and therefore is not loved as much by Jacob. Although it does say Leah's eyes were soft or tender, and then it goes on to describe Rachel's beauty. So they're kind of juxtaposing. Just a note, when it says that her eyes are soft, there's kind of controversy over what that means. It either means that there are blemishes on her eyes and kind of her eyes are faulty in the Torah's view, or that her eyes are her main attractive, I guess, her main like asset of her appearance, the thing that's beautiful. Yeah, go ahead.
I do want to point out that the fact that the Torah is immediately drawing our attention to eyes and the visual is kind of like can be interpreted as a hint, like you want to think about the visuals and the explanations of the visuals in this story and what they might mean. Like that her eyes, and we see what, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Exactly. No, exactly. I'm just gonna talk a little bit about like where I've come from with this story. So when I was a kid, Rachel was like my favorite. She was my favorite woman in the entire Torah. Part of it was my mom's middle name was Rachel, and I kind of drew a comparison between my mom and her because, you know, she's beautiful, and I saw my mom as superhuman, and she also had fertility issues and had ended up having 2 kids. And then when I sort of started interacting with the text in a more mature way, I think like through middle school and into high school, I started being more drawn to Leah and feeling this kind of like pity and empathy and sorrow for the way that she was always held up to her sister, especially as the older sister, and how she's kind of in this, I don't want to say loveless marriage, but she's always held to the standard of beauty that Rachel has. And I think there's a sense of incompetence that the Torah kind of ascribes to her.
To Leah,
yeah.
Got it.
Like having like a whole background. Like I think actually I had the opposite growing up. I don't know. I always like read books where like had this like thing for like sympathetic characters. And I always felt like Leah was sympathetic. Like I always just felt bad for her. And like I think we don't really have her perspective. Like I learned like something in like elementary school. I don't know if this has any like traction to it, but that like her eyes were soft because she cried so much. I don't really know how I feel about that. If that can like be like a valid,
right,
or is it her as like a lovesick woman, which I don't really know if that's true, because just again for more background is that Jacob was supposed to marry Rachel. That was the deal, because Jacob worked for their father, and instead they switched during the wedding, and when he lifted up the veil, he saw that it was the wrong sister, which like I don't know like how that is. Like was it autonomous? Like did she decide to be there? Was she forced into it by her father? Like we have no perspective on it. So I think it's so interesting that like she's always compared to Rachel as like a competitor. Maybe she doesn't even want to be, you know?
And also the veil as kind of covering the woman that Jacob intended to marry, right? And it's a very physical symbol. Like it's literally covering their appearance and tricking him into marrying the woman that he didn't want to marry. That was all
right.
To me.
Yeah, just to be clear, he marries her without lifting up the veil, right? And then I think they spend the night together, and then only when morning comes does he realize it was Leah. I think that's what I've always learned that doesn't really make sense. I don't know how you would not realize, but
Maybe it was dark, that's why.
yeah, I guess you couldn't hear though. Anyway, uh, but I totally agree that. Oh, and that's why in Jewish tradition you lift the veil and look at the bride before marrying them. But I do think it's interesting, the idea of like that Jacob chose the more quote unquote like beautiful one, and then um, like forces outside of his control kind of said like, no, that's not the quality that matters here, kind of.
I think it's also important to note that it was kind of a love at first sight type situation. So Jacob sees Rachel and like immediately he kisses her. Like he sees her, he doesn't get to know her, and he's like in love.
There's like another element of like just fascination with just the beauty. Like who knows? Like he had to work for 7 years, I think, for Rachel, and like was there like a deeper connection, or was it just from that one sighting?
Also, I find the connection between like the labor he has to do connected with whether he gets a woman. I find that very fascinating because it's like this value of physical labor that he's working for their father, and in return he like gets a wife and he gets to marry her. Like that's so surreal to me.
Sorry,
sorry, go ahead.
Element of like the fathers also, which comes up later, we're going to discuss with like Eob, the father, and how he views his daughters as like Rachel's the asset because she's beautiful, though he's going to get rid of Leah in this process by like forcing someone to marry her, and then also like getting both of his, like I think it's so interesting that he sees his daughters as like for profit, and he sees that one of them is less valuable because of her beauty.
Imogen, do you have anything to say? Like, have you interacted with this text before? What's your first impression? Like, what do you think?
Not at all. I was gonna ask, but Max like touched on it, like the purpose of like the whole like how the veil tradition like came to be. So I think it's interesting that it like came from this story. I guess like I was also wondering like was the like hiding of her face done on purpose, like to deliberately trick them into marriage?
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, well, I'm not sure. I don't know where the tradition of, I know that the tradition of lifting the veil comes from this story, but I don't know where the tradition of wearing a veil in the first place comes from. Is that something that happens at other weddings too, right?
Right, but I mean, we do have a very like, a lot of things kind of date back to the Bible in our society because it's so like Christian.
Totally.
I don't know actually if the veil was like a tradition before this or whether it was really just for the sake of covering up the appearance.
I think it must have been because I like imagine getting married and like the first time ever and just not seeing the face. Like I feel like it must have been a tradition. I don't know where it comes from, but I yeah, this is definitely what Max was saying. It's definitely where lifting it comes from.
But yeah, I do think you raised a really super important question, Relly, and one that I hadn't really thought about before, of like, did Leah have any autonomy in this situation? Was this like a conspiracy between her and Lavan, or was it really like he wanted to get rid of her and saw his opportunity and took it?
I think sort of that connects back to what Relly was saying before about Leah crying a lot. So actually the interpretation of that originally is that she was supposed to marry Jacob's brother, who is seen as like this not this upstanding person, Esau, right?
Like from birth?
Yeah, like from birth they were supposed to be married, and Rachel.
They're related at that time. That would have been intended because they're cousins or whatever.
Yeah, that kind of weird part of our history. So she was crying all the time because she was intended for this man who kind of, like was not the greatest man. So coming from that story, I mean, maybe she did want to marry Jacob. Like maybe she was like, this is the man I want to marry. And I feel bad that my sister wants to marry him too, but this is my, I'm older.
I think even then though, it's just like she wants to marry him because he's a good person versus being a horrible person. Like I don't know how much it was really, I want to marry him. It's more like I want to get married to a good person and this is my option, but it also like my sister. I don't really know how deep the rivalry actually runs and how much we like it's just like shown to us there's a rivalry.
Right, and I wonder what qualities were kind of considered attractive or desirable in a like life partner. Like Esav and Jacob have a very like
They're brothers.
clear, yeah, they're brothers, both sons of Isaac and Rebecca, and they're twins, and they have Esav came out first, and Jacob came out holding his ankle, and then they have a very clear like juxtaposition, kind of like they're each other's foils basically. I don't know if I'm using that word correctly, but where Jacob is very spiritual and focused on like the brains and thinking about stuff, and he spends his time in the tent or something, but then Esav is a hunter and spends his time in the field like hunting and stuff. So yeah,
that frustrates me, that the Torah paints this like really comprehensive view of both of these brothers and their personalities and their tendencies, and yet like kind of the corresponding women, right? They're also sisters. One's also older. The younger one is also considered to be, quote, more desirable. And we hear basically about their beauty and their fertility, and that's it.
Yeah, it also brings up to like the other main question is that women not just in the Torah, not just being valued for beauty, but also for like their ability to have children and like their child, like how many children they had, and like how like Leah's seen as the better wife or whatever because she has 7 children and Rachel only has 2, and like that whole competition of like needing to have children to like be the better wife, you know?
Right, and that is an interesting contrast, kind of, that like often I think that like the idea is you like beauty is associated with childbearing capability, right? Like historically, like wide hips or whatever, like whatever it's just all about your ability, like your evolutionary ability basically to produce and raise healthy children. But then the beautiful daughter in this case, Rachel, is barren for most of her life, I think, and then after a long time she's only able to have 2 kids, and Leah is able to have 7. Did you say 7? No, 5.
It possibly 7 sons, 1 daughter, or it's just 7 children in all. I don't actually remember.
Wait,
But
there's 12.
There's 12 in total with 4 wives.
12 sons and 1 daughter.
Yeah.
Well, here I'm googling.
We're not even mentioning that. I don't know what the English, would it be concubine? The English word for
Oh yeah. You probably want to talk about Bilhah and Zilpah on a different episode, maybe.
Yeah,
but,
no, they're very. Yeah.
But yeah, she has 6. She has 6 sons and 1 daughter, right? Leah.
Imogen, I'm interested in also hearing your perspective again as kind of more of a newcomer to the text. Like, what's your gut reaction? What are you starting to think about?
I mean, well, thinking about like how the more like attractive woman like had fewer children, I think that's sort of interesting. I want to like hear more about like what you guys think about that. Yeah, let's just start there.
Okay, so that's the thought that like all women like throughout like Tanakh and the Torah, that like their struggle and the way to get closer to God is not having children. Like it's seen with like very like Sarah, like Abraham's wife, and also later on like Hannah, like all like the main struggle being like trying to have children. So I think it's a very interesting thing to think about, that like the more desirable wife was the one that had less children. And I think it was about the greater like idea, like her getting closer to God. Like I guess Leah's way of getting closer to God was her being upset, like frustrated with her original match and being less desirable. And I guess Rachel's way of getting closer to God was asking for children.
So like infertility is a means by which to get closer to God?
Yeah, that's what I've always learned as like later, this is a very off topic, but like with Hannah, which is like in like prophets, is that her like the whole like her song is all about wanting to have children. Like that's a very common theme in Judaism, of like a woman being barren in order to get her closer to God and to reach out to God.
Wait, that's like really interesting. So they are infertile, or like not infertile, but they like do not have children on purpose to get closer to God? Because I
don't actually know, but that's the assumption that like God
No.
is like, the test. I guess.
Well, I mean, but it's not something they can control. It's something,
Yeah.
usually in the text, it's something like, yeah, they're barren, I'm putting in quotes, and they, and like the one thing they want in the world is to have children. At least that's kind of the narrative that,
It's interesting though, because like very, very soon after these descriptions of Leah and Rachel, like there is kind of a description of their rivalry and the fact that Leah has more children being like important in their relationship and kind of giving her more credit. Because one of Leah's sons is like harvesting mandrakes or something, which is a type of plant, but it's kind of symbolic of fertility. And Rachel's asking Leah to give her some mandrakes, like to give her some of that like symbol of fertility. And Leah's like, no, like these are mine. I actually don't remember if she ends up giving them to her, but there is that dynamic of like it almost gives Leah more grounds by which to be valued in the community because she has more children.
Something interesting I'm seeing right now on the Jewish Women's Art Archive website is that the rabbis present Lavan's act of deceit. Lavan is Rachel and Leah's father, as something in which Rachel was involved, from which they learn of her special qualities. So so I guess Rachel was kind of a co-conspirer in the matter, and Leah was. But yeah, it's in the morning. In the morning, he sees that it was Leah. Yeah.
Yes, I think okay, now I'm remembering this. This is like from elementary school, but like it was, I think Rachel was like, I think it's again painting Rachel as like the good one. And then the fact that like she was like, oh, I feel so bad for my sister, let me just let her get married to this guy first. Which I think is also interesting because I think it's kind of painting Leah as a one-dimensional character, which like obviously that's never true. So I think it's interesting to see that they're painting Rachel as like the one with the only good qualities, whereas like Leah is seen as like selfish and spiteful.
Yeah, but and then later in Rachel's life, she becomes a much more complicated character. Like there's a story where she steals, right, and she steals Lavan's idols as they're moving out, and then hides them, like, she sits on them, and then says she can't get up because she's on her period, if I am not confused. And then Lavan tells Jacob that if anyone in his group, in his camp, has the idols or stole them from him, then like he'll kill them or they'll die or something. And then Jacob's like, yeah, I'm totally fine with that, none of us have them. And then she actually does have them, and she dies later. But it's really kind of shrouded in mystery why she would take them and lie about it. And
I kind of love that story. Like I read that story and I was like, yes, like she's doing it. I think part of, we separate a lot of times like Torah from the real world, but it is important to acknowledge that like Judaism was not all monotheistic. Like there were polytheistic still remnants, and they were marrying into a very Jewish like legacy and tradition through Jacob, but at least through The Red Tent by Anita Diamant, which is kind of like Dina's story, but also the mother story, Rachel and Leah's story. By extension, it kind of tells it as she's holding on to her own culture a little bit and her own beliefs.
That's super interesting. And I think I've heard in elementary school when they were painting all the good characters as good characters and bad characters as bad characters, kind of, I think we were told like she wanted to make sure her dad didn't keep going on the wrong path, maybe, right? Like she was kind of committing a Abrahamic act of defiance and like separating him from his idolatry. So yeah, depending on different interpretations, it can totally read in opposite ways, as her holding on to it or her taking it away from its source.
Yeah, so I'm just gonna ask, I think then we're gonna move on to the next source, but I think that like again, like what Max was saying, I never thought about that, like the connection with Abraham, like how Abraham destroys his father's idols, and that's like his like call to grace and like his call to being like the Jewish leader, whereas like Rachel does it and then she dies because of it. So I think that's a very interesting, and again, we're in the next source, it's like a very show of the role a father plays in relationship to the children. So the next source we're going to do is from the English version is Job, but I'm going to say Eov in Hebrew. So the source is about how, just a little background of what the Eov story is that Eov, basically, we don't even know if it's a real story. It could be hypothetical, but it is basically, there's this man named Eov, and he's like the greatest man, they say, ever who lived. And he had many children, and he was the richest man, he had lots of cattle, and basically the devil tells God, hey, your servant Eov is only faithful to you because he has all these things. Why don't you try and take it all away from him? And so God takes everything away from Eov. He loses all his children, he loses all of his cattle and all his money, and he's like this poor man who like has boils all over his body. And the whole book is like we're not going to get into the whole story of the book, but basically at the end of the book, when he proves his faith, God doubles all of his possessions, so including his sons. So he ends up having, I think, 7 sons, or I don't know how many, but his sons are double, but his daughters stay the same. He still has 3 daughters. And so the description, and also it's notable that all the sons aren't named, but all the daughters are named. And then
wait, when you say they stay the same, is that like from his children at the beginning who died?
Yeah, from the beginning, because like when it says all his possessions were doubled, it also meant his children. Like the number of sons was doubled, but the
Wait,
number of daughters.
so what does that mean? He had a certain number of kids and then they all died, and then at the end of the story he has that number doubled of sons.
Yeah, that's a much deeper discussion of like, is that actually, like, how can you replace children even?
Okay, no, I was just confused by. Okay.
I agree with you. That doesn't make any sense. But here's what it says. It says, nowhere in the land were women as beautiful as Eov's daughters to be found. The father gave them estates together with their brothers. So we learned this in class, and this is what sparked my idea for this episode topic, about how my teacher was telling us about how the most, like, it's their description of the daughters is that they were beautiful. And that was the greatest joy to a father, that his daughters were beautiful. And so he gives them estates with their brothers. I think it's also interesting to know that he's giving his daughter the land, which was not common. We see that in another, I forgot the names of the daughters, but who, like in Tanakh, who are
Tzlachachad's daughters.
Yeah.
The 5 daughters who kind of get land, but they get land through legal means, and these daughters are getting land because of their beauty, which is interesting.
Well, I don't know if it's because of their beauty, but it's saying their father gives them their lands. But I think it's interesting that it's showing that even in like the stories like about, it's all related to Eov, the whole story. So it's saying in, like, I guess in relation to Eov, the most important thing about the daughters was their beauty, I guess, because again, that's what makes them valuable. Like, I'm putting that in quotes also, like that's what their value comes from, is this fact of like they're beautiful. And like even that's what the father seems to be thinking, is that's which again we saw before with Laban, but here with Eov is not like supposed to be a malicious character. He's supposed to be a good character, and still he sees his daughters and he sees their value in relation to money.
Yeah, and in addition to,
sorry,
say that again.
I said relation to money, I meant relation to beauty. Continue.
Oh, yeah. So there is definitely an idea that the father owns daughters as the default until they're married to a husband who then goes on to own them himself, basically. I mean, that's not true of all female characters in the Tanakh, but it is definitely like the precedent, I would say. And just another example of that, I don't know if we want to go in depth on this, but Yiftach, Jephthah, he says, he makes a vow before going into battle that if he comes back victorious, he'll sacrifice to God the first thing that he sees when he gets home. And then he wins the battle and then comes home and his daughter runs out to greet him. And then he says, and then he tells her that he has to sacrifice her. And she says, like, isn't that not allowed? And then I think it's kind of ambiguous, but then she basically goes away to live the rest of her life alone, I think. I don't know. We can.
Actually, she was sacrificed. Like, I thought he ended up killing her.
I don't know. I feel like I remember that too, but I That's not what it says. It says on Chabad.org, where I'm reading this now, it says, then Yiftach's daughter asked for a period of 2 months to bewail her youth, and she retired to live in seclusion, the life of a hermit. Thus, Yiftach's daughter gave up her happy and youthful life so as not to disgrace her father. I don't know. There's a lot to unpack there, but that was just another example of like that idea of ownership and youthfulness and fruitfulness being the main quality of women and daughters.
Yeah, I'm just gonna, based on what Max was saying, just go to the next, this is our last source on Devorah or Deborah. Again, I'm gonna call her Devorah. So a little, again, background on Devorah is that Devorah was, at this time there was like prophets who led the nation. So she was a woman who led the nation of Israel. And so the description of her in the text is Devorah, wife of Lapidoth, was a prophetess. She led Israel at that time. So again, and that's what Max was saying before, is that either women are seen as belonging to their father or their husband, because usually when they introduce a man in Tanakh, they say their father's name, but here it's saying, I guess, her husband's name, because I guess it's showing that that's who, again, air quotes, she belongs to. But also, again, here, there's no physical description of her. And so in our preliminary discussions over our group chat, we were discussing how that might be because she's seen as a woman in power, and so decides not to give her physical description. And so it's also seen that Devorah, like, she leads the army to they're defeating this man named Sisera with 10,000 men. So I guess that shows that she's the only woman who's there. But then again, what's also noteworthy is that in this story, also the person who kills the king Sisera is a woman named Yael. So Yael, she's a very interesting character, and her story is fascinating. Basically, she seduces Sisera and takes him into her tent, and she gives him a glass of milk, and he falls asleep, and then she bashes his head in with a tent peg. And she also, fantastic. There were 2 fantastic women within the same story, and Yael also gets no physical description. So it's noteworthy that whenever this woman is shown in power, there's no physical description of her.
Yeah, and that doesn't, I mean, Yael's seductive ability is kind of the like root, like that's her story basically, or at least in tradition, like that she lures him into her tent and then convinces him to fall asleep comfortably and stuff. But yeah, it's true that we don't get, unlike in the Torah where there's often descriptions of their beauty. And in Navi there are also descriptions of men's beauty also. David is called like beautiful, and his son also, Avshalom.
Yeah, and Shaul also.
Right. So and in different times the rabbis interpret it as meaning like righteous or good, or like peaceful, or vain, and power hungry kind of, or self-obsessed. So there's definitely a lot of kind of conflicting associations with beauty in male and female characters.
I don't know if this is like too general of a question, but like how does the description of like male and female beauty differ?
So it changes, I think, a lot. This is the first 2 sources were in I guess the Torah versus prophets. It's all the Bible, but whatever. So that was in like the Torah, versus here it's prophets. So I think there's very different writing style in the whole series of prophets, and I think specifically there is when there's like a big change in description, because I think there you see a lot more description of what, like Max was saying, like men's description, where like here in the Navi, the prophet, Devorah gets no physical description, but kings like David and like Shaul all do get physical descriptions. And I don't know what that means, because David was seen as like the greatest king ever, and he gets physical description, but also Shaul was very self-obsessed and self-absorbed and was a terrible king, and he's very focused on his beauty. So I think there's no answer. I think that's a very common thing in Judaism, that there's conflicting answers, like what do we know about it? But I think it's so noteworthy that these 2 women are here, and all of a sudden there's no physical description whatsoever.
Right. I mean, I would also say, though, that it's more of a given to have a physical description for women. Like kind of, Bambo, you were saying, when the men have these physical
I'm
descriptions.
Bambo, just
Okay, Max Bambo. As Max Bamberger was saying, like when the men have these descriptions, it means something in relation to their personality and their power, whether that's conceit or, I don't know, righteousness. But for women, it's very much an underlying thing. Like,
Yeah,
it's
like, I
normal.
think it's noteworthy that we're pointing out women weren't given a description, you know, because
Right.
it's always it's expected that women would have a description. Yeah.
I also, as like kind of bringing it back to today, I think it would be interesting to talk about how we perceive this as like, you know, some of us being women today, some of us just being feminists today. Because I do think like physical appearance, there can be so much empowerment through it. Like some people gain a lot of empowerment through how they present themselves and how they perceive themselves in their own eyes and others' eyes. But also the fact that like it can be the main description and the main value of a woman in the Torah. I just grapple with it, you know?
Right. Yeah. In a more general sense, like talking about like beauty and personal image, I think like yeah, when like what it means has a lot to do with who has control over it. Like it can totally be a source of personal empowerment, and if someone else is controlling it and saying you have to dress like this or you have to you know what I mean, in either direction, it can totally feel oppressive or freeing, just based on where the authority over that is coming from.
Right. And that's where like kind of feminist autonomy comes in. The fact that you have the choice to decide what's important to you and where your effort goes and where you place your value. I kind of see Judaism as pretty patriarchal in general. Obviously, or at least Judaism of the past, because society in general was kind of like that. So I think we're doing work to like redefine what that means for us. I'm interested in what you guys think, Imogen and Relly, about that.
So I think it's like I sometimes feel like I'm not an Orthodox background and stuff that like Judaism is very patriarchal, and I think it's also noteworthy to say that all these like majority of the commentaries we read are also by men, so it's hard to see what it really means, what the beauty really means, what this woman was really feeling at this time, because it's done by men, so like how can you can't really understand, you know? So yeah, I think it's complicated. I don't really like, I don't know, like I think it's such a problem here that we see so many women, like I think that Eve's daughters, like their sole character description is their beauty, you know? And I feel like that's a problem, obviously. But
I mean, his sons don't really get any specific character descriptions at all, right?
That like the sons get we don't see their names, we don't get any description. But the daughters, it's like, oh, the daughters are so valuable, they're so beautiful, you know, like that's the description. It's not like the daughters are so valuable, they're so smart, they provide so much, they help their father work the land, they help their father intellectually. It's no, the daughters are so special, they're beautiful.
Yeah, and on the flip side of that, there's also like there's huge value of feminine beauty in Judaism, or like you can look at text and say, wow, that's their most valuable trait, or you can say, I mean, there's also like we were talking about the Eshet Chayil poem.
You want to just explain a little bit about?
Yeah, so on Friday nights for Shabbat dinner, there's like a series of like kind of poems or songs that we sing before the meal, and one of them is Eshet Chayil, which is kind of, I think I've heard it's a description of like the embodiment of Shabbat, almost like as this like holy feminine figure, which is kind of cool, the idea of a time, like a personification of time, but also the ideal wife. And I think in a lot of households that I'm familiar with, at least, it's kind of a time to be like grateful for everything that the matriarch has done for the family in that week. I don't know if that's like a more my community, my experience thing, but and the whole point of that is that it says in the last couple of lines, sheker achen vehevel hayofi, which means grace is like a lie, is false, and beauty is like nothingness or mist or fluid kind of, and that like a woman with like faith and I don't know, like who provides for her family, all these other things that are still mostly focused on the woman's role within her family, but still aren't focused on beauty at all, are much more important than that. That's kind of like the thesis of that poem. So it's interesting that we have both sides of that.
The poem describes a lot of like the, I guess, like domestic tasks that women do, and also like the weavings that they make and the.
Yeah, I'm also looking at the text because I think it's I don't know, I always found it beautiful, but I also think it's a very interesting story.
Yeah, I was always a little uncomfortable with it, mostly because it describes women solely in this like cult of domesticity in the realm of the home, and also just it's in my family at least, like when we would sing it, my father would sing it and it was like coming from his mouth. We also, it's interesting, we used to sing it like primarily when my mom was like working a shift on Shabbat, so like when she was gone and it was just me and my dad, or me and my sister and my dad, which is I'm thinking back on it, I feel like that has some symbolism because she was working and she was working outside the home.
That's so interesting. And I mean, it's the like imagery is beautiful, and the tune and stuff. But it like talks about she girds her loins with strength, flexes her arms. Yeah, she realizes that her enterprise is profitable. Her lamp does not go out at night, and then there is like domestic kind of like keeping a strong, stable home and stuff. But then also generosity, holding her hand out to the poor, and extends them to the destitute.
Also, I think there's this line that says, it's an interesting line. It says like about her husband, she treats him with goodness, never with evil, all the days of her life. Which I think, again, there's so many conflicting feelings in this poem, because again, I like that it's saying that like charm is deceptive and that beauty is like not the only thing that matters. But then again,
it defines her
strength. She has all these beautiful things, and it's also like, but she never treats her husband badly, which I think, again, in one hand, that's very nice, but on the other hand, doesn't say her husband never treats her badly. It says she never treats him badly.
mean, but it is about her. But yeah, you're right. It is kind of like we don't really get a lot of praises of men in relation to their children or their wives or their families, whereas that is like really the focus of.
Yeah, I found it kind of weird because this is like the one poem dedicated to the woman,
but it is here just for some context. Sorry, it's it's from Proverbs, which is what's Proverbs?
Isn't it Ketuvim?
Yeah, it's Ketuvim, right? Wait, but
that's part of Tanakh.
Here, Mishle is the book of Proverbs. Mishle, so it's by Shlomo. So it is like a biblical text from that era. Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ava.
No, I was just gonna say if we're gonna use these words, we should explain them. So, but those were just kind of names, and translations of Proverbs. But even so, like in some ways, I kind of saw it as this one concentrated time in which we appreciate women, and the rest of the time they're like providing for their families and doing all this work. And
I also think it's noteworthy that the time that we're appreciating it is after supposedly like when the women create like makes the house for Shabbos, and after she's done all this work,
Right.
housework, then we'll
Yeah.
we're about to eat all your food. Thank you for doing everything you've done, and then that's it.
I mean, like I do want to say, at least in my house, like Shabbat afternoon, Friday afternoon is kind of a time when we like look back on the whole weekend, recognize like stuff that we're proud of in all members of our family, like whatever, kind of give praise all around and gratitude to. It's like a reflection time on the past week, so I don't think it's necessarily saying we're not grateful the rest of the week, or like we're grateful specifically for or we're not grateful for what she like. Her value is not important outside of keeping the household tidy and food on the table and stuff. But yeah, that is definitely important context to have.
It's funny because as I'm thinking about this, like the thing that drew me to that song was in our bencher, in our like book of Shabbat prayers and poems. It had roses all over it. Like the page was the most beautiful thing in my opinion. It had these pink roses, and the rest of the kind of book had, it was pretty, but this page had the roses, and I was like, this is the most visually appealing thing, and that's kind of what drew me to the song in the first place. So I bring it up just because it plays into this idea of visual perception and beauty in relation to women. Yeah. Imogen, any last thoughts? Anything you're thinking in particular?
I mean, I'm just sort of like, I feel like I've taken a very like passive role in this conversation just because like you guys have so many cool things to say and I'm just like taking it all in. But yeah, overall it's like what I've gathered is that like the woman's role, like I guess that's been established by the Torah is like very much one that's dedicated to like domestic work and like bearing children and stuff. And yeah, I don't know.
And we break those barriers if we want to. If we don't want to, we can also be domestic and have children, because that's okay too. With that, let's like give ourselves a round of applause or something. I don't know. Yay!
One second. Before we end, we have to do our tradition of how's the plant doing?
Oh my God! Wait. Still not alive, but not dead.
That's what matters.
Woohoo!
Woohoo!
Yay.
Name is
Limbo.
Esther. Get into that.
Maybe I'll get my lap desk because I feel alone.
I thought it was my lap desk in the mail today, but it was.
Wait, you got a lap desk?
Not gotten it?
It was this book, but I haven't gotten it yet. Have you gotten yours, Relly?
Yeah, you want
to? Oh,
see
you're.
it? 1 second.
Yeah, please. Oh, is the podcast over? Do we want to?
Yeah, I'm gonna stop recording.
Here, so let's say thank you and good night.
Good night. It is Central Time, 4:32 p.m. CDT. Hello. Thank you. Goodbye.